uh, purpose of those who are not able to sit in. All right, so let us begin by explaining why the information discussed in this seminar is important. I'm not sure if everyone took the time to watch the Spider-Man Attack of the Octobot episode, so I will briefly review some of the highlights of the story that are relevant to our discussion. In the first portion of the story, Spider-Man is conquered by his enemy and nemesis, Dr. Octopus. And Dr. Octopus has not only conquered Spider-Man, but he has erased or neutralized Spider-Man's memory of who he. Like Spider-Man, our African ancestors too, who were brought to the Americas and the Caribbean islands and other parts of the world, came already charged with a rich cultural identity and fascinating gifts. But the colonizer and the enslaver made every effort to dim the memory of these cultural roots and to dim the memory of these cultural practices so that they would not be used by enslaved Africans to liberate themselves. For example, the use of the drum was banned for enslaved people. And we know the drum in African societies was often used to communicate messages. Hence, for example, during the Stono Rebellion of 1739, the drum was used by enslaved peoples to communicate with each other during the rebellion. And not only that, indigenous naming systems, the name in African societies, often carried rich symbols of tribal inheritance, spiritual gifts, social rank. And these too were also replaced by European enslavers to confine the African spirit to a European identity and worldview. In the story, Spider-Man's memory is erased. But not only that, this leaves room for Dr. Octopus to impose on Spider-Man a destructive identity. So Dr. Octopus has erased Spider-Man's memory so that Spider-Man will essentially become the arms and legs of Kingpin's crime business. So what happens as he erases Spider-Man's identity, he tells Spider-Man who he is, and he tells Spider-Man that he's a criminal, which we know is not true. And as African Americans, we also have taken on more American identities. And these American ideals and worldviews, in one way, supports our upward mobility in the society, both socially and economically. But in other ways, they destroy our extended family structures, our African roots, and our African culture. For example, let's take a look at this quote by Howard French, who is an American journalist. French says, for a very long time in the 20th century, during the Jim Crow era, during the Jim Crow years in particular, African Americans were encouraged to shun the idea of a connection to Africa, to think poorly of Africa, and to celebrate traits in themselves which supposedly distance themselves from Africa. In other words, to think of themselves as more cultured, more Christian, more white, and more civilized than Africans, and therefore to look at Africanness as a matter of shame or a kind of taint that needed to be avoided. So we see the aggressive suppression of African culture and identity during enslavement led to descendants of formerly enslaved Africans in the Reconstruction and Jim Crow eras to identify more with their American identity and more with the American worldview. And so African Americans during this period and the time after them became more distanced from the African culture based on a perception of Africa that was imposed by the very people that enslaved them. One modern example of this, a carryover from about 13 years ago, is a young man by the name of Jabray George. He's an entrepreneur in Miami. And this is what he had to say. And not all of what he has to say is problematic, but he was dealing with this idea of being called an African American. So he says, we respect our African heritage, But that term is not really us. We're several generations down the line. And if anyone were to ship us back to Africa, we would be like fish out of water. That portion is not problematic. But this is where some of the problematic points of his statement come out. He says, Africa was a long time ago. Are we always going to be tethered to Africa? Spiritually, I'm American. And when the war starts, I'll be fighting for America. So going back to the Spider-Man story, Spider-Man is actually reluctant to accept the criminalized identity that Dr. Octopus is proposing that he has. So he says this can't be true. And Dr. Octopus, in response to that, he says, well, don't take my word for it. And he clicks on to a news media source from the famous character J. Jonah Jameson. And J. Jonah Jameson is going on about how Spider-Man is this menace, how he's useless to society. And so Spider-Man actually begins to internalize this identity that Dr. Octopus has imposed on him. And what he says is, I must be some piece of work for this guy to hate me so much. And when we think about African-American life, to this day, media continues to attempt to reinforce ideas of African-American and African inferiority. And unfortunately, many of us as African-Americans are also drinking the Kool-Aid of self-hatred, assuming that American news media sources are reliable sources of truth on African-American life and African-American culture. Here's an example of media imposing a negative identity. This is a news source from Iowa. The same day, the same state, two burglaries took place. One on the left was done by three University of Iowa wrestlers. And you look at their photos in the news article, they're presented in a very stately manner. And so one might look at this and say, these are young men who have lost their way, but at their core, they're really good. They're really good young men who have lost their way. On the right, there are four African-American men convicted of the same or charged with the same crime. But look at their images. Look at how they are depicted. In the same state, by the same media source, we see two different narratives being produced about two different types of people groups. Not only that, we see this also with national narratives. Here's a white gentleman in America who's begging, and he's asking, where is my American dream? In a society that is centered around white supremacy, the American dream has failed a white person and continues to fail many poor whites around the country. But we never think of America as a poor nation. Meanwhile, this is a skyline view of Ethiopia and Addis Ababa. But when we think about Ethiopia, this image rarely comes to mind for people. We think of starving African babies, begging, lack of food, and lack of water. And so these images are being reinforced through the media to tell the story of Western superiority, European superiority, and African inferiority. And unfortunately, these narratives are not only being enforced by secular media, these narratives have traditionally and historically also been reinforced by the Christian church in Europe and in America. What you see here is an image of the slave Bible. This Bible was a British Bible that was given to enslaved peoples in the Caribbean islands. This Bible took out, for example, stories of the Exodus, which might incite liberation. And so we see that even the Christian message, when presented to enslaved Africans, was curated to justify and to reinforce European domination of the world. And not only that, interpretations of these stories in the Bible and of these texts in the Bible were also designed to do the same. Going back to our story of Spider-Man, Spider-Man loses himself He doesn't remember who he is. And Dr. Octopus has proposed that he's a criminal. So the only option that he's left with is to accept the identity that Dr. Octopus is proposing to him. So if you had a chance to watch further on past the 6-minute mark, we see later on in the story that Spider-Man not only has embraced and internalized this negative identity of himself, but he also begins to carry out behaviors from this identity. Not only does he believe that he's a criminal, he begins out of that belief to act like one. Again, we see this with the African American community, and particularly in relationship with white religious iconography dealing with Christianity. There is a scholar, Dr. Simon Howard, who I believe is at the University of Miami, and he does studies on the psychology of racism. One of these studies that he did in 2017 showed that exposure to white religious images, particularly white Jesus, produced in white people anti-Black attitudes. But not only did they produce in white people anti-Black attitudes, when Black people were exposed to images of white Jesus, they also in themselves internalized pro-white attitudes and anti-Black attitudes. And what's particularly significant about this study is that it's not just images of general white men. It's specifically images of white Jesus that are producing these types of attitudes within the Christian context. And so this is why this particular seminar, the information that is produced in this seminar, is very important and relevant, particularly if you are African American who embraces the Judeo-Christian religion and faith. So let us begin by outlining some of the goals of the course series as a whole, and then we'll identify some of the objectives for this particular session. One of the first goals we have is to reframe the biblical story in its authentic ethnological context. And we'll explain what ethnology actually means and how biblical ethnology works and operates. The second goal that we have is to demonstrate the central role of Africa and Africans in the Bible story. A lot of times when we talk about Africa and Christianity, we're only taught the side in which Europeans brought Christianity to Africa to subjugate Africa. But there's a whole nother side of this story where we actually see the development of Christian tradition, Jewish tradition, being actually birthed out of Africa, and specifically the Nile Valley civilizations. Third goal is we're going to just demonstrate the central role of Africa and Africans, not only in the Bible, in the Bible's history and story, but in the development of biblical theology and understanding. And lastly, we're going to offer an approach to biblical study that is authentic historically and that encourages African Americans to embrace their African heritage in a way that is consistent with biblical teaching. Objectives for this particular session: we're going to demonstrate the presence of African landscapes and landscapes ruled and occupied by Africans in the biblical narrative. Secondly, we're going to compare modern sources of history and archaeology with biblical historiography. So in other words, we're going to look at what secular history and secular science have to say about these civilizations, and then we're going to point back to the biblical narrative to gain a deeper understanding of who these people are in the text and in the biblical story. And then we're going to demonstrate the role of natural habitat in developing theology and spirituality. We're not talking about African landscapes this evening just for the sake of proving African pride or Afrocentrism, I should say. But we're actually going to talk about how the natural habitat for any group of people is very important in developing the theological ideas and their spiritual technique. As your presenter, I feel it is in good faith for me to present my positionality. I do not believe that any human being is capable in and of themselves of being objective, but I do think the best that we can do is to acknowledge the ways in which our experiences have formed and shaped our work and formed and shaped our perspective and how we approach our work. So there are several experiences and cultural identities and roots that I have that have produced the questions that have thus produced this course. So the first is, I'm an African descendant. I am a descendant of the African diaspora. I was born here in America, but I love and embrace my African roots, my African heritage. But I also am a disciple of Yeshua of Nazareth, the man that we know as Jesus. So I look to embrace ways, and I'm on a journey to embrace African culture in a way that is consistent with the Messiah's message. So I have a dual thing going on where I am definitely for African liberation, for the uplift of African people, but within the context of Yeshua's kingdom vision or Jesus's kingdom vision. Also, having grown up in a Christian home, I have a value and a respect for the Christian Bible. And so the source material that you'll see throughout this text will continuously reference passages that are drawn from the Bible. I've also had university training. So you will also see in the course where I will cite sources of secular history and modern science as a way to corroborate or to compare with the biblical narrative. And lastly, I believe in the potential of the Black church. One of the reasons that I wanted to do this is because the Black church is still the most financially robust institution in the Black community. And so if we can rectify the theology within the Black church, we can reclaim the Black church again as an oasis that it once was for the liberation of African American people. All right. Now let's get down to the nitty gritty. To begin, we're going to frame this course and do what is called a theoretical framework. There are 2 to 3 pieces that are important for understanding how we're approaching this particular study. The first is the study of ethnology, which we referenced earlier. Ethnology is the study of characteristics of different ethnic groups and the relationships that are shared between them. And so what we're going to be doing in this context is looking at the Bible as source material to understand the culture of the early Hebrews, the people that we see and read about in the Bible, the descendants of Abraham. What does the Bible have to say about the traditions of these people, how they looked at themselves, how they worshiped, how they practiced their faith? And then we're also going to look to the civilizations in the Nile Valley from which they came and sometimes in which they lived, and explain or attempt to explain the relationship that was shared between these two people groups. When we talk about Africa in the Bible, Africa, we know, is a very large continent with now over 54 nations and thousands of different ethnic groups. So for the sake of this course, we will be dealing with, in particular, 2 specific Nile Valley civilizations. Historically, these civilizations were known as Cush and Kemet. Cush, you may know as Ethiopia. It's typically what is translated to in the English Bible. And Kemet, you may know as Egypt, as the modern country of Egypt. The reason I selected these particular groups, these particular civilizations, is because outside of Israel, these 2 civilizations are referenced in scripture more than any other place. Kemet being referenced over 600 times in the biblical narrative, and Cush being referenced over 30 times. And for context, or for comparison, Greece is only mentioned about 20 times, or excuse me, about 4 times. And Ephesus and some of the other churches in Asia Minor that we're quite familiar with in the New Testament are mentioned roughly only 20 times. So these civilizations are very, very important as they're referenced again and again in the biblical narrative. But not only that, West African civilizations, for example, the Akan people, trace their lineage back to these Nile Valley civilizations. And when we talk about the Akan people who reside in Ghana today, which is where a lot of African American and Caribbean ancestors were taken and enslaved, when we discuss these particular Nile Valley civilizations with African Americans or with members of the diaspora, we are essentially talking about their ancestors' ancestors. So there's a direct link between these Nile Valley civilizations and the diaspora of today. So lastly, we'll be using a biblical ethnological paradigm. We talked about ethnology being the study of different cultures and people groups and the relationships between these cultures. When we talk about biblical ethnology, we'll be using the Bible's model for understanding a people group. And if we look at Genesis chapter 10, if you had a chance to read that source material that was provided in your email, you will see that the Bible continuously identifies people by 3 L's. These are the 3 L's that we must remember. The first we're talking about today is lands, but we also identify people by their lineage. And lastly, identifying people by their language, which is an aspect or subset of that people group's culture. So this is how we will proceed. This is the foundation from which we will proceed into the course. All right, so when we look at Genesis chapter 10, we're provided a table of nations. For context, God has sent, the Supreme Being has sent a flood to wipe out all of humanity and all of creation, save Noah and his family. So Noah becomes the father of humanity by default. He's the last patriarch left. And through his lineage, there are 3 sons that are born that essentially people the earth, so to speak. We have Ham, which we typically refer to as Ham, but in Hebrew, his name would be Ham, is how it would be pronounced. And he becomes the father or the common ancestor of the African peoples. And we'll show and demonstrate how we actually come to understand that. Then there's Shem, whose name means the name. So if you're familiar a little bit with Hebrew, for example, Baruch Shem Kavod, blessed be the name. Shem means the name in Hebrew, and it becomes a central part of the theology of the Bible. And Shem, the common ancestor, he becomes the father of the Asian peoples. And when we say Asia, we're not only talking about East Asia, which is the Asians that we know today. We're also talking about Western Asians, which would be the region of the world that we now call the Middle East. This is Shem. He's the father of these people. And lastly, we have Japhet, whose name means beautiful. And he's the father of the European peoples who inhabit the Isles, the northern region of the earth. So when we talk about Africa in the Bible, we obviously have to begin discussing specifically the lineage of Ham. And when we identify Ham with Africa, we do that because the etymology or the origin of his name. The name Ham means hot, burnt face, and or black. And what is going on here, there's an etymology that's also related with Greek. When we talk about the term Ethiopia or Ethiopia, the Greek term means burnt face and black. And it's referring to the region that these people inhabited. And as a result of inhabiting a hot region, these people's skin was sun-kissed or burnt. And so therefore they developed a darkness in their skin. And as a result, they were known as either Ethiopians by the Greeks or Hamites by the Hebrews. And you can see this if you want a reference in the Strong's Concordance. It'll show you the Hebrew origin of a lot of these terms and what they mean. So when we again look at Genesis chapter 10, we see that Ham has 4 children. The oldest is Cush, and Cush is the region that is south of Egypt. And I'll show you a little bit on a map. where exactly this is on the African continent. But generally speaking, it's in East Africa, just south of Egypt, along the Nile. So it's again a Nile Valley civilization south of Egypt. Mizraim, which may not be a familiar name, Mitzor or Matzor in Hebrew means frontier, and Im is plural. So when you attach the Im at the end of any Hebrew word, it pluralizes it. And so what you have is Mitzrayim means the two frontiers or the two borders. And this is typically known by scholars to refer to the southern and northern kingdoms of ancient Egypt or ancient Kemet. And so Mitzrayim becomes the Hebrew term for Egypt in the Bible. Put is generally the third son of Ham, is generally identified with Libya, which is also in Africa. It's north and west of Egypt. Many of us may be familiar with Muammar Gaddafi. Gaddafi was a ruler of Libya in Africa. And lastly, the fourth son, the youngest son, is Canaan. And Canaan, even though he's a descendant of Ham, and he's black as a result of being a descendant of Ham, his land is in modern day Palestine or Israel, which means that the early inhabitants of Israel were dark-skinned peoples who traced their lineage back to their African father and continued relationships with their African cousins. This is a source from Bible Hub. I typically don't cite sources like this, but this information is really good. And they're kind of an online database for Hebrew and Greek terms. So this is what they had to say about Ham and the Table of Nations. The Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10 maps the spread of these families, the descendants of Noah, the spread of the families, the descendants of Ham, across Africa and the Near East. Now, highlighted that because when we talk about Ham, we're not talking only about the African continent proper, even though that's where their headquarters were. These descendants would also extend their territories into what we call the Middle East today. And I'll show you this on a map. The diverse cultures arising from Ham's descendants produced early advancements in architecture, trade, and governance, yet would also become frequent neighbors, rivals, or oppressors of Israel. So we have a very complex relationship between the descendants of Ham and the Israelites. Sometimes they were neighbors, sometimes they were lovers, sometimes they were rivals, and sometimes they were conquerors with each other. So just like any family and any relationship between families, things can get complex. All right, so when we talk about Hamite presence, again, we're not just talking about the African continent proper. We're also talking about Hamites that extended their territories into today what we would call the Middle East. And here's an example from Genesis chapter 10, verses 8 through 12. Cush became the father of Nimrod. Nimrod was the first on earth to become a mighty warrior. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, which will later become Babylon, which is in Mesopotamia, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. These are all Mesopotamian lands in today what we would call the Near East or the Middle East. From that land, he extended into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. All right, so here's a look at the map, and hopefully this will help better frame it in your mind's eye. So we see the three sons of Noah, Ham, Shem, Japheth. To the left, I don't know if you can see my clicker, but this is the African continent. On the left, the bottom left side is the African continent. This is Egypt. This is Cush, Ethiopia. Havilah is where modern day Eritrea, northeast Ethiopia, extending into Somalia would be if you go further down. And these are all descendants of Ham. Seba is a descendant of Ham. Havilah is a descendant of Ham. And then we go over across into the Arabian Peninsula. We see Dedan. Dedan is a descendant of Ham. We see Sheba at the bottom in the just across the Red Sea here. Sheba is also a descendant of Ham. Then we go up further north, right here to the Tigris and the Euphrates. Again, in what we will call the Middle East, we see Akkad, Shinar, Babylon, and Erech. This is where Nimrod established the extension of his territory. But Nimrod, remember, his father is Cush. So his base came from East Africa, and he spread across the Red Sea and brought civilization to what we call Mesopotamia. Here's another picture that better highlights it. In red, you will see areas inhabited by the descendants of Ham. In green, you'll see areas inhabited by the descendants of Shem, the Asiatic people, and particularly the Hebrews come from the line of Shem. Eber, for example, is a descendant of Shem, from which we get the term Hebrew. What I want you to notice is how interlinked their lands are. We see Ham, the red, in the Near East on the Arabian Peninsula, all up and down the Red Sea. But we also see Shem sometimes in Africa, which suggests that the Hebrews also developed themselves out of Africa. We'll talk a little bit more about this. We see this particularly with Havilah. When we get to W.F. Albright, he will share some more information with us about Havilah and how there's an Asiatic and an African branch of the same tribe. So these people are one tribe, but they're mentioned in two different tables of nations in Genesis chapter 10, one under Shem and one under Ham, but it's not two different people. It's the same tribe, but across different regions and different families. All right, so here's our theme song. I hope you got a chance to listen to not King James Version by Still Pulse. Out of Africa came the Garden of Eden is the refrain for this particular session. We're going to demonstrate that with the text, and then I'm going to show you another map again. Going back to Genesis chapter 2 in the beginning, the reason that we had to start with the Table of Nations is because, generally speaking, Moses is acknowledged as the bearer of the Genesis narrative, as the one who scribed the narrative of Genesis. And so he is operating from the ethnological table in Genesis chapter 10 to describe things that happened in Genesis chapter 2, if that makes sense. So when we see the name places that are mentioned in Genesis chapter 2, even though Genesis chapter 2 and the narrative comes before Genesis chapter 10, the name places are named after the descendants of the people in Genesis chapter 10, because those are the names of the places at the time in which Moses was writing this tradition. Hope that's explained in a way that's clear. So we see Genesis chapter 2, verses 10 through 14. A river flows out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divides and becomes 4 branches. The name of the first is Pishon. It is the one that flows around the whole land of Havilah. Remember, we saw Havilah in East Africa, where there's gold, and the gold of that land is good. Bdellium and onyx stone are also there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It is the river that flows around the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is Tigris, which flows east of Assyria, and the fourth river is the Euphrates. So based upon our table of nations that we see in Genesis chapter 10, the Garden of Eden exists in Africa, and it flows out into lands in the Middle East, but those are lands that were occupied at a very early time, in the earliest of times, by descendants of Africans, i.e. Nimrod. So looking at our map again, the river Nile is the river Pishon. We'll actually show you a source reference that will describe that when we get to Albright. Down here, where this split is, where you see Seba, is where the Gihon is. So the Pishon and the Gihon are typically considered sources that flow into the Nile, southern sources that flow up from the south to form the Nile. And then, of course, we see the Tigris and Euphrates. But again, as you can see on this map, or I should say on the next map, where the Tigris and the Euphrates are, where Syria is in red, which means it was occupied by Hamite descendants, descendants of Africans. And this particular region was inhabited by Nimrod. So this is a sketch of potentially what the Garden of Eden would be like. So when we see Havilah, this is the African continent, bottom left. Cush, the Horn of Africa right there. Asher, Assyria. Then there's some other theories about the Pishon and the Pishon in particular that place it in India, but it's relatively far-fetched, and there are very few scholars that actually embrace that view. Most archaeological scholars link Pishon and Havilah with Northeast Africa. And this is significant because when we talk about the Garden of Eden, we're talking about the first concept of a holy land. The first concept of a holy land included the Nile Valley, portions of Africa. All right, here's W.F. Albright. Albright was a biblical scholar and archaeologist in the early 20th century. I sent you this article yesterday, I believe. This is some quotes from this article dealing with the location of the Garden of Eden. So he says, the Havilah of Genesis chapter 2 refers certainly to the African Havilah rather than to the Asiatic Havilah, which lay opposite, since it is said to produce good gold, gum, resin, and malachite, all of which are important products of the Nubian desert, and two of which at least do not seem to have been found in Western Arabia. This is the country which is called Punt in the Egyptian inscriptions, and which provided rich treasures of gold, gums, and spices, and also malachite through gold and malachite, though gold and malachite were drawn in great quantities from the Nubian desert directly east of Upper Egypt. And it's important to note here that Upper Egypt is not Northern Egypt. Upper Egypt actually refers to Southern Egypt. The reason that it's called Upper Egypt is because of its elevation, not because of its location to the northern region. So Upper Egypt is actually Southern Egypt, and from Esne southward, and of Nubia, which is identified with Sudan and western portions of Ethiopia also. He goes on to say later, the two rivers Pishon and Gihon must then be tributaries of the Nile, which is the longest river in Africa, or preferably, since the Nile itself is not mentioned, two streams which unite to form the Nile. There are two possibilities then, the Nile and the Atbara, or the Blue Nile and White Niles, which follow respectively from the highlands of Abyssinia, which is modern Ethiopia. So that's another important note. When we talk about Cush, we're talking about what is today properly Sudan. Even though it's translated as Ethiopia in the English Bible, that Ethiopia of the ancient Bible is referring to Sudan. When we talk about ancient Ethiopia or ancient Abyssinia, we're talking about the land that is referred to now as Ethiopia. I know that can be confusing. We can talk about that and clarify that further later on. Albright goes on to say in the same article, the meaning of the southern localization is shown by Jubilees, which is an extra canonical biblical source. In chapter 8, especially verses 15 through 19 and verses 21 through 23, which states that Eden, the Garden of Eden, lay in the far south at the source of the Gihon, which we know as the Blue Nile, he says, i.e. the Nile, between the allotments of Ham and Shem. Since the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates were by this time well known, but the sources of the Nile was not, it was assumed that paradise lay at the source of the Nile, and probably that the two rivers flowed from it. Here's an image of the Blue Nile, the River Gihon, which is sourced by Lake Tana in modern Ethiopia or Abyssinia. It looks like paradise. It looks like this a central location for paradise. That is my wife and I overlooking the Blue Nile Falls. All right, so we have the Garden of Eden, which is the first holy site mentioned in the Bible. And we understand that a portion of the Garden of Eden is on the African continent proper, and that an extended portion of Eden is in lands that were at the earliest of times occupied by the descendants of the Cushites in Ethiopia. Now we're pivoting to another holy site, which is the concept of a promised land. We first see this concept come up when in Genesis chapter 15, when Abraham is given a promise by the Most High. God says to him, "To your descendants, I will give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates." So when we talk about from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, God is essentially borrowing again the same landscape that's in the Garden of Eden, and that becomes the first promised land. Okay. When we look at the way that the land is described from the river of Egypt to the river Euphrates, this is what that looks like. To the left is the African continent. The Nile runs all the way down. If we count the tributaries, it runs all the way down to a little past Uganda in the south central regions of Africa. So we see that the African landscape would have made a great portion of what was originally the promised land to Abraham. Now let's look at some secular history that corroborates that, because essentially what the Bible is saying is that human life began in Africa. And not just human life, but life, all life began in Africa, because the Garden of Eden is where God began creation. What you're looking at now at your screen, on your screen, are pictures of the earliest fossils known to humankind, the earliest fossil. This is known as Lucy. Australopithecus afarensis is her scientific name. She was found in the eastern portions of Ethiopia. You can see her remains today in the National Museum of Ethiopia in Addis Ababa. Her remains are dated to 3.2 million years ago. So we see that modern science, even though some Christian scholars get into a tussle about the dates, but we see modern science corroborating the location in the narrative, and that is important. The date, depending on who you ask, how old the world is and stuff like that, that is a different discussion for a different time. But we see modern science pointing to the earliest signs of life being found right where the Bible says they would be found, in the Nile Valley, particularly around the region of Cush. You see, again, this is another map of where exactly Lucy was found. Where you see Bahadar on your screen is where the Blue Nile, the River Gihon is. So just above Bahadar, you see that little body of water, that's Lake Tana, which feeds into the Blue Nile, which is a little white line on this particular map, and it feeds into that uh, Nile River flowing upward into Egypt. You can't really, it's not designed for you to see it on this particular map, but for your reference, I just wanted to show you that. Okay. All right, so this is an image of an Omo 1 skull. So, to full transparency, they actually have found a skull, a human skull, Homo sapien skull, that is older than this Omo 1 skull. But I still wanted to share it with you because this skull is also very ancient. But at the same time, the other skull was also found in a different region of Africa. So there's that. Uh, so regardless of how you slice it, the oldest Homo sapiens are still found in Africa. I think they found some recently that are now in Morocco, which is in Northwest Africa. But it's still, every time they keep coming up with these old skulls, they're always found some part on the African continent. But before that discovery, the oldest skull was known as Omo 1, which was also found in Ethiopia. So we see again the Nile Valley being consistently corroborated by modern science as a source for early human development. This skull was dated to about 230 years old and is found again almost exactly within the radius of where the Bible describes the Garden of Eden. So here you see the Omo Valley. The Blue Nile is right here, if you can see my clicker, where Bahadar is. That's the Blue Nile. Omo 1 is found just south of that in the Omo Valley. So when we talk about Kush, we're also talking about the earliest human civilization that is known to mankind. Where you see on your screen is an image of the coastal incense burner. This is one of the oldest finds of a royal inscription. And actually, it's kind of produced a kind of chaos amongst archaeological scholars, particularly Egyptologists, because they found on this incense burner a facade, a palace facade that has always been associated with Egypt because Egypt was studied first. So once they found this incense burner, even though it's dated older than any other Egyptian artifact, they keep saying that this is an Egyptian symbol. But perhaps because this is the oldest of the symbols, perhaps Egypt was bearing Kushite symbols, which would fit with very well with the biblical narrative because in the table of nations, we see Cush listed first, which suggests that he is the eldest brother or the eldest descendant of Ham, which means that Egypt or Mitzrayim would be his younger sibling. So and this artifact dates to 3200 BCE. The royal inscription suggests to us that at this point in history, Cush had some type of emperor. Why else would there be a royal inscription buried in the cemetery of a man unless he was an emperor? Or unless they had some type of emperor. When we look at Kemet, the dawn of Kemet or Egyptian civilization, we're talking about just 100 years after that. Mind you, these are the first two civilizations known in human history. And you can look at, this is Namar. Oh, excuse me. This is a bust or symbolic depiction of the first king of Egypt, Namar. Look at that nose. Look at those lips. That's an African nose, and those are African lips. First king of Egypt, 3100 BCE. At this time, there was no Europe. This was before Homer and the Greeks. There was no European civilization at this particular time in history. And Africa, the Nile Valley in particular, already had emperors and cities. When we talk about, again, connecting it with the etymology of Ham, don't just take it from me or take it from the text. We can also look at secular historians like Diodorus, who's a Greek historiographer. He says in one of his books, the Library of History book, number 2, They say that the Egyptians are colonists sent out by the Ethiopians, and the larger part of the customs of the Egyptians are they hold Ethiopian customs. So we see again the Greek chronicles are telling us that Cush came first, then Egypt. We'll see from Herodotus that both of these civilizations were black, that they bore most of the time dark skin and woolly hair. We'll see it again in Herodotus, another Greek historian. He says, "For it is plain to see that the Colchians are Egyptians, and this that I say I myself noted before I heard it from others. I myself guessed it to be so, partly because they are dark-skinned and woolly-haired, though that indeed goes for nothing, seeing that other peoples too are such." So what he's saying is almost everybody in the ancient world at that time was dark-skinned, but there are also some specific cultural features that link these two people groups. He says, "But my better proof was that the Colchians and Egyptians and Ethiopians are the only nations that have from the first practiced circumcision." Now, where have we heard that term from? We'll come back to that when we start talking about language and culture. Some of the culture and the language that was shared between these Nile Valley civilizations before there was actually an Israel. So before the Israelites, before it was revealed to Abraham in Genesis, forget which chapter it is, for God to perform, where God commands him to perform circumcision, the Ethiopians and the Egyptians were already practicing said practice. All right, rounding out the bin. Thank you for your patience. Then we'll open the floor for questions and comments. Why is this particular information important and relevant to the biblical narrative? The reason that this information is important when we talk about landscapes is because landscapes are not just random places for humans to exist on. They also become the sources of inspiration for culture. The natural habitat is what governs our physiology. It governs our social interactions. It governs how we survive. And these things form the basis of theology and spirituality. And I'll show you this in a little bit. Another article I sent you in your email correspondence was that of Jacques Marquette. Marquette argues in that article, culture has been defined as being a social heritage, but looked at from another viewpoint, it is a system of adaptation of a group to its environment. In other words, what happens, a people inhabit a particular environment, and then the ways in which they adapt for survival to that environment become their culture. Okay? He says the most urgent aspect of adaptation consists in extracting from the natural habitat that which is necessary to maintain the lives of individuals. This is why the production of material goods is the basis of any culture. Culture is birthed out of survival in a particular habitat. So if we're talking about the Hebrews and we're talking about the biblical narrative, and we're talking about the Hebrews in the biblical narrative in Africa, we are saying that the techniques of their culture were birthed from the African landscape. He goes on to say this production depends on the natural resources offered by the habitat and the utilization of techniques at that society's disposal. So based on that, on Marquette's definition, I want to propose a new definition of theology and spirituality. That theology, a community's views of God or the supreme being, is a subset of that society's culture and is the culminating result of that society's contemplation on the natural environment, and particularly how those forces in nature that are beyond human control or direct intervention become the basis of survival. Okay? And I'm going to show you some examples of that in the text where the Bible actually corroborates this particular definition of theology. When we talk about spirituality, we're talking about a technique, a society's technique to express that theology. So we have theology, a view of God that is often based on forces of nature in the natural habitat that are beyond human control. Then we have spirituality as a technique to live in harmony with these forces. Okay? That is essentially the basis of theology and spirituality. Let me give you some examples of cultural development from habitat. On the left, you have injera. Okay, injera is a bread that is made from teff. Or excuse me, actually, this is injera on the right. Excuse me, injera is on the right. This is the bread that is often eaten in Ethiopia and is made from the teff grain. Now in Sudan, which is their neighbors, teff doesn't grow. It's not a major crop. It may grow in some areas, but not enough to sustain a people. In Sudan, wheat is more popular. So they make the same type of bread, but with a different grain, because that's what the natural habitat allows them to use. So in this culture, in the Sudanese culture, they eat this type of wheat bread. But in the modern Ethiopian culture, they eat injera made from this particular type of grain. The reason why is directly linked to what grows in the natural habitat. So we see this bread becomes a part of this particular culture's identity around food. This bread becomes this particular culture's identity around food, but it all is dependent upon where they come from regionally. On the left, you see a bundle of frankincense, which is grown in East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. Then you have Palo Santo, which grows in Peru, used for the same purpose. But frankincense doesn't grow as much in Peru as Palo Santo does. But we still have the same concept. We're burning a type of incense that is used in our spiritual practice, but based upon where we are regionally, this is what we use. And this becomes a part of our culture and spirituality. Here's some evidence of this particular view of theology in the Bible. When we talk about the contemplation text, the Proverbs, the Psalms, David says in Psalms 19, chapter 1, the heavens, in Hebrew, heaven means sky. The sky declares the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. So David is looking at the natural habitat, and he is formulating things and ideas about God based upon what he is taking in from his natural habitat. Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 3 and 4, God came from Teman. Supreme being came from Teman. His glory covered the skies and the earth, and it was full of his praise. His brightness is like the sun. So we're talking about the natural habitat, the sun, but the sun, the contemplation of the sun gave the early biblical writers ideas about God. So now we have this affiliation with God and light, God and sun. When I look at your sky, Psalm chapter 8, verse 4, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are humans that you are mindful of them? So we see the contemplation of the natural environment is what is producing even a lot of the biblical literature, the biblical ideas. So if the early Hebrews were in Africa, that means that they were looking at African lands as they were making these contemplations, or lands that were once at the earliest of times inhabited by African people. We see it again, and this is an extra canonical source, but I'm going to show you why it's relevant to the biblical text. This is taken from the book of Jasher. And the book of Jasher is not in the Bible, but it's quoted in the Bible. If that makes sense. So the book of Jasher is not included in the canon of our current Bible, but in the Bible, references are quoted from the book of Jasher that are in our Bible text. And I'll show you exactly where those are. So that's why I felt that this was relevant to use. He says, and the Lord gave Abraham an understanding heart, and he knew all the works of that generation were vain, and that all the gods were vain and were of no avail. And Abraham saw the sun, watch this, shining upon the earth. And Abraham said unto himself, surely now this sun that shines upon the earth is God, and him I will serve. And Abraham served the sun. in that day, and he prayed to him. And when evening came, the sun set as usual. And Abraham said within himself, surely this cannot be God. So we see that Abraham, based upon his region of Mesopotamia, according to this extra canonical but referenced narrative, did not begin with a monotheistic concept. That his monotheism actually developed out of his continued contemplation of the natural environment and evolved over time. So he starts with saying, the first thing I'm going to worship is the sun, because that's what I see in my natural habitat. This must be God, because the sun gives light to the plants, it gives light to the humans, it is a life-giving source. But the sun sets, so this can't be God. So he continues his search. He says, and Abraham continued to speak within himself. Who is he that made heavens and earth? Who created the earth? And he says, and night darkened over him. And he lifted up his eyes toward the west, the north, the south, and east. And he saw that the sun had vanished from the earth, and the day became dark. And Abraham saw the stars and the moons before him, and he said, surely this is the God who created the whole earth as well as man. And behold, his servants are gods around him. And Abram served the moon, and he prayed to it all that night. And in the morning, when it was light and the sun shone upon the earth as usual, Abram saw all things that the Lord God had made upon the earth. And Abram said unto himself, finally, surely these are not gods that made the earth and all mankind, but these are the servants of God. So Abram arrives at his monotheistic perspective and faith as a result of contemplation upon his environment. This quote is taken from the book of Jasher, chapter 9, verses 10 through 19. But the book of Jasher, even though it is non-canonical, is referenced by name. You can look at it in Joshua chapter 10, verse 13, and 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 18. All right, closing out. Culminating epiphany and point, and then we'll open the floor for questions and commentary. Theology is formed from human contemplation on the natural habitat. As we talked about with Marquette, and theology being a subset of culture. That theology is not just provided out of a vacuum. God did not just drop the Bible out of the sky, okay? The Bible was formed as a result of theological contemplation over thousands of years, men and women continuously looking at the natural habitat and gaining revelation from their contemplation that formed the theology and the spiritual practice that we find in the Bible. The Garden of Eden and the Promised Land become these first and earliest concepts of a holy land. So when we talk about holy lands become centers of contemplation. Holy lands are places where people take pilgrimage and they develop themselves spiritually. And the first two concepts of a holy land, the Garden of Eden and the Promised Land, were comprised in great part of African landscapes. And then the parts that weren't African landscapes proper were lands that were occupied and cultivated and civilized by African people. Why is that important? Because these African landscapes and the people that occupied them provided the inspiration for early Hebrew theological contemplation. What am I saying? I'm saying that to properly understand the biblical theology, you must have in your mind a proper framework of the African landscape. If you do not have a proper understanding of the African landscape, you cannot understand the Garden of Eden, you cannot understand the Promised Land, and therefore you cannot really understand the meaning in its fullness of covenant until you deal with Africa in its proper context. These two concepts, the concepts of the Garden of Eden, the concept of the Promised Land and the Holy Land, are biblically incomplete unless you deal with Africa. Culminating evidence. We're going to show you some in the text. This is a prophecy from Isaiah. On that day, there will be 5 cities in the land of Egypt that speak the language of Canaan and swear allegiance to the Lord of hosts. One of these will be called the city of the sun. On that day, Israel will be third party with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth, whom the Lord of hosts has blessed, saying, Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my heritage. Isaiah chapter 19. So again, biblical prophecy. How can you understand this prophecy if you don't deal properly with the land of Egypt? From beyond the rivers of Cush, my suppliants, my scattered ones, the diaspora, the Hebrew diaspora, from beyond the rivers of Cush, beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my suppliants, my diaspora, my scattered ones will bring my offering. Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 10. Among those who know me, I mentioned Rahab and Babylon. Babylon, again, the early time was developed by Nimrod, son of Cush. Philistia, too, and Tyre with Cush. This one was born there. This is a messianic prophecy. This one refers to the Messiah. Are you not like the Cushites to me, O people of Israel, says the Lord? Amos chapter 9, verse 7. And that concludes this presentation. I wanted to take a brief moment at the end of this presentation to wish Emperor Haile Selassie a 133rd Earth Strong and birthday. Today would have been his 133rd birthday. The reason that he is relevant is because he is a descendant of the tribe of Judah in the region of modern Ethiopia. He also is considered defender of the faith, and he's an extension, the last emperor of Ethiopia in the tribe of Judah, the tribe of Solomon and David. So that concludes our presentation for this time. We'll open the floor for questions and commentary. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Aaliyah, for joining us and for enjoying the presentation. Are there any questions? You can feel free to type your questions or to raise your hand, and we'll give you the floor to ask your questions. Or if you would like to make a comment, you can do that either in the chat box or by raising your hand or by just unmuting your mic and speaking, whatever is easiest.
I guess I say something. So I remember earlier in your presentation, you were saying how the images of white Jesus and the effect it have on the black community or other communities kind of remind me of that episode on Good Times where Michael kept trying to switch out the Jesus
Yes.
and his mom just kept saying no, no, no. And like you said, from like the early 1900s to up, you would see like magazines, they either light skin or white Jesus, this and this, which like you said, made colorism more, bad. And then like you said, the black church for a long time really had a white Jesus in their church because that's what they were shown, that's what they were known, and anybody that went against it was gonna be look crazy. So I
Yes.
thought it was a good point to bring up how the effect of having that on black community. Cause you just see in the past, like they will look at you crazy when we say, "Hey, take it down."
Yes. Yes. Thank you for that point. And that's actually very important for those who might have logged in after that particular point in the presentation was made, is that this presentation is not just drawn out of a vacuum. It's dealing with, it is an attempt to address some of the narratives about Africa that are harmful to African Americans, but at the same time, ironically, are often propagated even in the Black church in America. And so this, Aaliyah was pointing out very pointedly that when we are exposed to white religious iconography and Eurocentric interpretations of Christianity, it actually induces this study that we showed earlier by Dr. Simon Howard. His study showed that that actually induces not only pro-white attitudes in African American parishioners, but anti-black attitudes. So it's not just that, oh, we're for white people. No, we're actually will become against ourselves as an essentially African people. So thank you for that, highlighting that point again, Aaliyah. Any other questions or comments? Oh, yes. Sister Marbury, yes. Please, please let us know what you got. Talk to us. I think you're on mute, so we can't hear you. You're still on mute if you're trying to speak. I saw your hand raised. Or you can type if you feel more comfortable typing. In the meantime, are there any other questions or comments?
I have another comment. I like the point where you were saying how a lot of West African tribe of people are traced back to Eastern Africa. I thought that stood out because, like you said, I don't think people understand a lot. Majority of the Bible was in East Africa, and people don't understand that. And I know some people, always say, well, what's the connection of the West Africans who was taken here from like other African parts? I thought that was interesting when you was like, okay, it's found that these are traces back. So I just wonder what made them move from East Africa to West over the times. That's something I wonder why.
Oh, yes. That's a great question. I'll have to go and look at that again. I imagine there were certain natural factors as the Sahara dried up, maybe potentially that inspired their migration westward. But that'll be interesting to pinpoint some reasons for their migration out of east to west. But yes. Sister Marbury's back with us. I see you, but I can't hear you still. Okay,
Okay. Can you
there
hear
you
me now?
Yes, ma'am. We can hear you now.
Okay. Thank you. That was a great presentation. Thank you so much. I just had one question. I know the Bible does not definitively say but where the Garden of Eden was, but just from looking, listening at you and your location when you was talking about Cush, does that lead us? Is there anything that we could interpret to say that that's where the Garden of Eden was?
Yes, I would say that because it gives us a description of the lands and who the lands are named after the people that inhabited them. So when we
Mhm.
talk about Kush, there is an actual historical land, Kush, the Kushite civilization, which I attempted to show. I can go back in the presentation and show you the map again. Um, Let me go back all the way back. But yes, this is where the Garden of Eden would have been. Well, I can show you on here too. So this is a more modern map. So you see that blue line going up and down the continent?
Yes, I do.
That's the Nile River. So here is Khartoum, that's in Sudan. If we go to this little nodule here, we have the Blue Nile. This is what the Bible calls the River Gihon. So when I showed the quote from W.F. Albright, he was saying that the Pishon and the Gihon, which are the two rivers that are mentioned in the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 2, these are linked to these particular water sources in Africa. So this this landscape would have comprised the Garden of Eden, the first parts of the Garden of Eden.
Okay, great.
There's a tradition in Ethiopia, and I'll see if I can go back. So the Blue Nile Falls. So the oral tradition in Ethiopia suggests that this region is actually the center of the paradise, the center of the Eden paradise.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a church, I didn't add it in this presentation, that actually marks places where Adam and Eve are said to have been. So.
Oh, that's interesting. That's that's good. I mean, it's teaching. It's very good teaching, but it's not traditional teaching that we are used to. Because all the times of me growing up and all, it was never, the Garden of Eden was never referred to as African descent.
Yes.
Never was, so that's good. Very good teaching. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I want to ask another question. So how do you feel about that information? I'm very interested. When people learn new things, like what feelings came up for you as you were discovering some of this information for the first time?
Well, to be totally honest, just being completely honest, at my age and looking at everything that you've been ingrained and taught so much over the years, but I am a person that's always open to learning, regardless. I'm open to learning. So it immediately makes me want to dive in a little deeper and learn more. I just, since I got that, I take it as a little tidbit because I hadn't been, exposed to this all of my life. Let me see, you're at an advantage. You're young, so you're starting off with a different mindset than I did. So it makes me want to just dive in a little bit deeper and learn more. And
Yes.
it's basically right now where I am, I just want to learn more and increase my knowledge. So when I when you have a belief system in something, you want to have a strong knowledge base as about it as well.
Yes.
So that's how I am. I just want to right now. I'm really intrigued about it, and I just want to learn more and get more educated about it. So when you start believing in something, if you want to tell somebody else about your belief, you have to be educated enough on it yourself in order to educate somebody else.
That's right. That's
So,
right. Thank you
so
for
thanks.
sharing that. And I'm glad that this presentation has produced in you a desire to learn more. So I'm
It
really
is.
glad to hear that.
It is. All right.
Yes. Any other questions? Thank you for that question. Any other questions or comments concerning the presentation?
Hey
Oh,
PJ, hey everybody. No questions, but just want to just commend you on an amazing presentation. I really appreciate how you started us out with the comic narrative, the comic Spider-Man narrative, and then took us to a history that really underscores our why and the importance of what you're doing, and then providing us some conceptual knowledge and terms related to theology and culture. It was beautiful. It was beautiful. Right, exactly the kind of information that's needed. Um, and I just encourage you to continue on, and just am grateful that you have been obedient to the very clear call. Um, yeah, this was time well spent.
thank you so much. That's really high praise. I, of course, admire your work as well and appreciate the work we've been able to do together. So I really appreciate the encouragement. Any other questions or comments before we close out? Okay, so thank you so much for taking this time to be with me and to allow me to share this information with you. Um, Before I let you go, I want to, well, I'll send it in the email because I know some people left. So I'll be sending your emails a survey regarding the course. I would really love if you could just take some more of your time to provide an honest feedback and reflection. I appreciate the comments that have been shared here, and I take those to heart. But the survey covers very specific areas of the course. So please take some time to do that. And the other thing is, this is just one module. So we still have to get to the to the lineages and the languages and to the theology aspect in more detail. So there will be more presentations in the future. I'll be sending you dates and times and things like that for those presentations. Unfortunately, I'm not able at this time to set a clear date yet because Brandy and I are moving to Ethiopia, God willing, and we don't know exactly what our Wi-Fi connection and signal will look like yet. But once we get there and get on the ground and get settled and we discover all of those little intricate details, we will let you know a date in the future, and we'll have another one of these if the Lord says the same. So thank you so much for your time. God be with you all. May God give you health. May God reveal more to you in your studies and your journeys. Thank you so much for coming and spending this time with me. God bless.
Good night. Thank you so much.
Good night.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Aaliyah.